In Unit 2, you studied the SRM, Safety Risk Management, and the SA, Safety Analysis components individually. Now, in Unit 3, we're going to put the two processes together and show you how those two components work together interdependently. That is, that they depend upon each other. Here's your SMS diagram that we've shown you in each of the PowerPoint presentations so far in this course. In this video, we're going to talk particularly about the interrelationship between the two, what they call working components of the SMS. That is the Safety Risk Management, SRM, and Safety Assurance, SA. Those two components, they call them the working components of the SMS. They work together. We're going to show you how in this video. Here's a representation of the SRM and SA components, the elements under those components, side by side. Under each component, you have learned in previous units that there are several elements. First thing I want to point out about this is that safety management is a decision-making process. Everything we're going to do here leads to the actual decision that we make. It helps us make better decisions about risk, about hazards, and about safety. Okay, so we're going to work through the SRM and SA elements from top to bottom to show how they are similar to each other. The first element in both components is to gain an understanding of the operation. That is, we describe the system in SRM or we monitor the system in SA. So it's to gain an understanding of the operation. The next element, the second element under each of these components, is to drill down into the specific details, identify hazards, and gather any information on the system's dangers. After gathering the information, then, we seek to make sense of it. In the SRM component, this means we analyze the risk, qualify, quantitatively or qualitatively, but we qualify the severity and the likelihood of an event that would have resulted from the identified hazard. In the SA component, we analyze the data that's gathered through internal, external audits, feedback, etc. So those are analyzed. Following analysis, where we make sense of the information, following that, again, moving in both components, a decision is made. Does the data support acceptable risk or not? Depending upon the answer to this question will determine what happens next. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But first I want to finish out the elements of these two components. So here's the decision-making element. That's where we're at. We're going to move back to that in just a second. But finally, I wanted to talk, just introduce the last aspect of each of these processes is to take the necessary action. So once the decision is made, what we're going to do, then we either control the risk in the SRM component or we take corrective action if necessary in the SA component. So let's talk a little bit more about that decision and the resultant action now. The SRM process is initiated to evaluate the system's design. Please understand that. SRM is about system design. The SRM process starts anytime there is a new system design, a change to a system design, or anytime you design a new risk control. So let's work through this as an example. Let's say, let's use our Calvin and Hobbes example. Let's say you're getting ready to go sledding down a hill with Calvin and Hobbes, and one of the hazards that you identified in the hazard identification element, one of the hazards you identified were trees. You conduct the risk analysis, it's here, and you determine that the severity and likelihood of the risk of becoming injured due to hitting a tree, well, you determine what that risk is. You evaluate the severity. Will you break a bone? Is it catastrophic? What is the likelihood that you will hit a tree? How many trees are there? Do you need to turn the sled as you go down the hill? You evaluate that severity and that likelihood in order to determine what the risk is. It gives you the risk. In your decision then, the risk assessment, say the risk was too high. It was unacceptable or acceptable with controls. For our purposes, let's call the risk acceptable with controls. That means we need to design some controls into our system in order to mitigate the risk. How do we do that? Let's give some examples. Say you decide to wear a helmet, use a sled that has steering, and perhaps you have a grappling hook that you can use as a brake. Those are identified in that risk control section. Then the process with these controls goes back to the beginning and starts again. Now we reanalyze the system with the controls in place. Hazards are identified again, risk is assessed, risk is analyzed, and then the decision is made. The severity and likelihood criteria are evaluated through the lens of your controls. Now in our case, we have lower likelihood of running into a tree due to our steering and braking systems on our sleds, and we have a lower severity. If we were to run into a tree, we have lower severity due to wearing a helmet. Say this time then, after analysis, you determined that the risk is acceptable. Only once the risk is determined to be acceptable does it go over to the safety analysis component for monitoring, and here's where it goes. The risk is determined to be acceptable, it goes over to the SA component, and then as you tear up the slopes with your sled, you monitor it through the SA component. Now, through the SA component, you learned about the elements in the previous lesson, so we're not going to go through all of those. But when you get to system assessment, that's the decision-making point of the SA component. It's time to make a decision again. In our example, say, you have been playing on the slopes with the sled all day, and your risk controls, your steering, your braking, and your helmet are working fine. The SA component then simply continues to monitor the system. You continue to monitor the system, you pay attention, use situation awareness, understand what hazards or what changing environment is going on around you. You simply monitor the system, and it's your continuous loop. You monitor, you analyze, you make a decision, things are going good, and you continue in this loop. However, let's say then your steering mechanism, let's take a couple steps back. Say your steering mechanism is not working as well as advertised. You are having a hard time steering around the trees. Get this part. You have a steering mechanism as a control. The steering mechanism, that control, is not working properly. So understand this is crucial. That control that is not working properly moves from system assessment. That's your decision. You decide the control is not working properly. It moves to the corrective action element of safety of the SA component. Okay, so as you're in the corrective action section, now you correct that control and then continue to monitor the system. Say you put an enhanced steering system on your sled, then you continue to monitor the system, and it continues to progress. So now let's take another step back. Suppose that as you continue to tear up the slopes in your sled, you begin to realize that there is a road at the bottom of the hill and traffic is starting to pick up on that road. That's the change in environment. Changing environment will generate new hazards. Through system monitoring then, as you're doing this system monitoring in the SA component, you identify a new hazard. When you identify a new hazard in the SA component, that goes to the start of the SRM process for analysis. So here we are, we're sledding. We determine through system assessment that we have a new hazard. That new hazard then goes to the SRM component for analysis. So let me summarize that real quick. Old hazards that aren't working, they go to corrective action and continue in the SA component. That's old hazards that aren't working. We determine there are new hazards. New hazards go back to SRM for analysis. So, safety risk management is to evaluate system design. Safety assurance is to monitor system performance. If the SRM process indicates risk is acceptable, it goes to the SA component for monitoring, and it goes right on up to the top, goes to the SA component for monitoring. If, however, the SRM process indicates that risk is unacceptable and needs further control, those controls are implemented and the SRM process runs again until the risk level is acceptable, which means as low as reasonably practical. Then, and only then, only once the risk is determined to be acceptable, does the risk move from the SRM component to the safety analysis component for monitoring. During system monitoring, if assessment indicates the risk continues to be controlled as designed, the SA component continues to monitor. It's controlled as designed, it continues to monitor. If the SA component, however, indicates that a risk control is not working right or has not been implemented correctly, that is, a control is not working or has not been implemented, corrective action is taken. That corrective action is taken in the SA component, and then the system continues to be monitored. If, however, during system monitoring in the SA component, new hazards are identified, then they go to the beginning of the SRM component and starts the process all over again. That is a summary and an example of how the SRM and SA components work interdependently with each other.